And thank you so much for being on the programme. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
So you've written a book on leadership. Does that mean you think the world needs better leaders?
No, I'm not. I'm not sitting there thinking I've got all the answers. But it's a book based both on my experience as Prime Minister of a little over 10 years, but also in the work my institute now does, with 40 different leaders and more actually around the world. And the thing about being a leader is that in any other walk of life of importance, there would be lots of books written about what are the guidelines, what are the rules, what are the lessons. And yet there isn't really for political leaders. So it's written in a very simple way, I hope easy to read way, and just is based on what I learned.
It's interesting you say that there's no kind of guidebook for how to be a good leader. And it did make me kind of reflect a bit on leadership here in the UK and some of the issues that we've had there. We had the Grenfell inquiry out yesterday, which really laid bare, I guess, like a failure of successive governments. Made me think about the post office scandal, the infected blood scandal, these injustices that have gone on for decades. Do you accept there has been a failure of leadership and of government?
Yeah, I think, look, it's a difficult thing to say, but it's the honest truth. However good your system is, and however well-intentioned it is, and however hard people work, they're going to make mistakes. And it's important you hold people accountable for those mistakes, of course. But I don't think you're ever going to get a situation where decisions are perfectly taken in perfect circumstances and there aren't accidents or tragedies that occur. It's just important every time they do occur to try and learn the lessons of them.
And you say, you talk about leaders growing into the job, getting better, because at the beginning you don't really know, with the greatest respect, kind of what you're doing. Is that why some of these problems happen? How do you change the system if you don't know what levers to pull, if you don't know what's broken?
Well, it's a great question. And of course, it is a question you confront, because in most walks of life of importance, you'd never think of putting a CEO in place in a large company that hadn't had experience of leadership in a company. You wouldn't go into the stands of football supporters and say, OK, give me the most enthusiastic person, we'll make him coach of a Premiership team.
Well, some fans might think they do a better job than the bosses, right? Might have a point.
Maybe, but I think most fans would say, no, I think we want someone who's had a bit of experience. So it is an extraordinary thing. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is that, it is difficult. You do learn a lot as you're doing it, but if you can shorten that learning curve, it's to your advantage and to a country's advantage. And the really interesting thing is, when you look around the world today, the difference between the countries that succeed and fail, it's all about the quality of governance and decision-making. And, you can get the countries side by side, same resources, same potential, same opportunity to succeed or fail. One succeeds, the other fails. It's all about the quality of the decisions. And therefore, if you can help leaders, at least ask the right questions about how they set themselves up to succeed rather than fail, and it should be good.
What was your biggest mistake?
I always say to people, it's for me to know and others to find out. But I'm sure there's a lot of people who would say it's over post 9/11 and Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. But I've debated that issue many, many times.
Is that what you think, though? It's easy to say what other people might think. But what do you?
I think for me, the thing that I learned most is the need right at the outset, if you're going to make change, to assemble the right people and the right policy in place that's going to deliver you long-term structural change. And in my first term, leave aside all the foreign policy stuff, in my first term, when we tried doing reforms, they weren't, although we did many reforms, they weren't in health and education, law and order particularly, they weren't the reforms I really thought were the right ones. And in my second term, when I reorganised government, introduced things like the delivery unit, and which is now replicated in different parts of the world, I had a much clearer understanding how to make the system work and how to do deep reform.
It's interesting. It feels a bit like you're saying that you should have gone further, if anything, earlier. You talk about the best leaders being change makers. And it's hard to say, when you came into power in 1997, you did quite a lot of radical stuff quite early. You gave the Bank of England independence. You talked about the minimum wage. Look at Keir Starmer. He's cut the winter fuel allowance. He's made a few speeches about how difficult everything is. Do you think he needs to be a bit more radical?
Well, I think he will be radical as he sets out his he's set out these missions.
But now is the time, isn't it? This feels to me like this is part of the message of what you're saying. You've got to make the most of when you've just been elected.
Yeah, I think
push through and get things done.
That's true, but I think to be fair, when we came into office, there were certain very clear things that we were able to do that just created a different atmosphere, a different sense of where the country was going. Because, remember, there were still huge amounts of discrimination against gay people. We didn't have a minimum wage. We didn't have a mayor of London. We didn't have devolved institutions. The Bank of England was still, essentially, interest rates were set by politicians. These were things that we were able to do that were very obvious to do. I think it's a much tougher situation today, but it will all depend on these missions that he set out. And, the government's got to, it's going to have a fair run of doing that. I mean, the thing that I am saying in the book and what I think is open to question, but definitely should be debated, is this technology revolution that I say is the single biggest thing going on in the world today outside of all the geopolitics, is that the thing the government should focus upon? And my view for any government today around the world is that this is a new era of technological change, and to be able to understand it and master it and harness it is going to be the essential determinant of success.
You talk about AI in particular.
AI in particular, I mean, it's not the only part of it, but AI is, in my view, its own revolution, generative AI another. And when you get finally to artificial general intelligence, which is the next development over the coming years, I think the changes that is going to bear to make in the way government functions, public services function, never mind private sector companies, is going to be enormous. So if you take the health service today, and to be fair to Wes Streeting, he's absolutely on this, you're not going to reform the health service other than through the application of technology, through giving people electronic health records, using health data properly, making sure that we can switch to early prevention of disease rather than curing disease. So, and actually I could take you across the whole of government and give similar examples. So for me, this is the big question. And, we've been through an election where it's not really been debated.
I just want to read a sentence that really stood out to me in your book. You said, the leader sets out for the people what they need and not simply what they want. Does that sound a bit arrogant?
Yeah, which is why I say this is going to sound weird to you, but I honestly think it's really important, this. I mean, I think I quote the old Henry Ford thing about, the Ford Motor Company, when he was asked, why don't you give people what they want? And he said, if I ask people what they want faster horses. The job of the political leader, I mean, of course, your job is to do your best for the people and to advance their interests and their prosperity and their well-being, of course. But your job is to lead and not just to follow. You see, so if all you're doing is just, if you're trying to work out through opinion polls or looking at social media, what is it they're saying? OK, let me go off and do that. That's not leadership. I
guess, some people might be listening to that thinking, what you're saying is, the people, they don't really understand what they need. I know. Oh, the great leaders, we know what you need. Don't worry, we'll just sort it out for you.
Yeah, this is something you probably only say when you're not running for election, right? I mean, I remember having a conversation with someone in the course of the Brexit debate, and I was explaining the single market and why it was important Britain stayed in the single market, and he sort of said to me after a time, look, you're just this typical elite. You're just trying to say that you know more about it than I know.
This is it. It does.
What I said to him? I said, I do know more because I've been Prime Minister for 10 years. So actually, I'm in the deep. It doesn't make me smarter than you. It doesn't make me better than you. But you've got to get the relationship right between political leaders and the public today. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where, it's a good thing that we're not in an age of deference. And it's a good thing that people challenge leaders. But that means you've also got to bring people into your confidence as a leader and say to them, look, these are difficult decisions. And you can't just put a set of demands on my desk and say, go meet them all.
But is there a risk, though? Look, I just want to talk a bit about the riots, and I think it's very important with, at the outset, I'm not in any way suggesting that the violence and the rioting that we saw in the street is in any way reflective of what the majority of people think, right? But it was traumatic. It was a traumatic, shocking, quite frightening moment for the UK. Is there a risk that, I guess, the far right are giving a narrative to people who don't like the establishment? They don't feel that they're being listened to. They feel that they're being patronised.
Yeah, absolutely. But and you're completely right in what you say, because
you've got to take responsibility for that, haven't you? As,
of course you do. But
here's
the thing that you've got to do: taking responsibilities, not the same thing as saying, OK, this is what you think, so I'm just going to go and try and do it. You've got to engage people in a dialogue, and you've got to. I mean, in respect to the rioting, look, it's clear you have to deal with it, and I think the government and Keir dealt with it extremely well. But yes, you've always got to be looking at the underlying grievances. But here's the difference between leadership and followership. It's not just a question of listening to the grievance and then just doing whatever is the latest wave of opinion on it. It's actually looking at the grievance and thinking, how do we deal with some of the fundamental questions? This is why I always say about immigration, you've got to have a policy that deals with it, that deals with the anxiety of people, that the system is without control.
A lot of people would say, you're to blame for some of the distrust around things like immigration.
Yes, immigration, people sometimes say to me now, well, you had an open-door immigration policy. We absolutely didn't.
There was a significant rise in immigration. That is fair, isn't it?
There was a rise in immigration because, of course, our economy needed people to come in. And a lot of that immigration came from people from Europe coming to our country. And at that point, we did a freedom of movement within the European Union. But immigration was still less than half of what it is today. And on asylum, which was the real issue, as I came in, there was escalating asylum claims. We reduced those very substantially and were dealing with the claims at about 5 times the speed of today. So, the idea that towards the end, by the way, I put forward what is the only solution. If you want to deal with immigration properly, you've got to know who's got a right to be here and who hasn't. Because at any one time, the biggest problem on immigration is you have a large number of people, could be anything from 750,000 people, who are here without permission. And that's why in the old days, it was about identity cards, but today a digital identifier is important for all sorts of reasons, but including that one.
I just want to kind of zoom out, because I've been looking at the UK, and I think it is important to look at the global picture that we see as well. Because it does feel like that we're seeing an awful lot of, I guess I would describe them as kind of like strongman, kind of macho leaders, like a kind of rise of populism. Is that something that you are worried about, relaxed about? What do you think?
No, I am worried about it, but you've got to understand why it's happening. And it happens when you don't have a strong centre that's delivering. And people often think of, because I get criticised for being a centrist, which I'm perfectly happy to own up to, but the centre is not the mushy middle between left and right. It should be the place of solutions. I mean, the truth of the matter is today, and this will, as this technology revolution progresses, by the way, it's become more and more so, you're going to have politics is going to be much more fragmented. You're not going to have the same loyalty vote that you used to have. People will make up their minds, as they did in the last election. You've got a splintering of political parties. And the other thing that's going to happen is that people are, if there are grievances, they are going to expect you to deal with them. And the centre has got to be the place that you deal with them. If you're simply sitting there trying to manage the situation or say, well, this group's extreme, that group's extreme, that's not going to work. So I've got a very, very clear sense of this, that in the end, if you want to defeat this sort of strongman populism, you defeat it by the solutions.
You've spoken in interviews recently about Donald Trump, about Vladimir Putin. One person who I am quite interested to get your perspective on is Benjamin Netanyahu. What kind of leader do you think he is?
Well, look, I'm still involved quite a lot with what's going on in the Middle East right now. And so I'm not going to get into commenting on individual leaders, since that wouldn't be very helpful to what I'm doing. The most important thing is that we get a ceasefire that's sustainable and that we find a path back to some concept of security for the Israelis and self-determination for the Palestinians. And that's as much as you're going to get on that one.
If I did try to ask you whether the UK was right to partially suspend arms exports, what would you say? Yeah,
what I would say to that is I'm not going to start second-guessing the UK government on these issues. And as I say, I'm involved myself in what's happening there at the moment. And I just hope we can we can find a way out of it, because what is happening is truly terrible. I think the risks of escalation in the region are huge and urgent.
You've said that you found it difficult giving up being Prime Minister, which some people may have got a sense of the fact that you are, in your institute, you're kind of writing reports, you're writing books, so you definitely get that sense. It's a pretty small club of ex-Prime Ministers. We know you talked to Keir Starmer. I don't know if you talked to Rishi Sunak. What advice would you give to him?
Oh, people have got to make up their own minds what they want to do. And look, the thing about, I always say to people, especially when you get, nowadays, you're getting leaders who are leaving office quite young. I mean, I was 54, which nowadays is quite young, when I left office after 10 years in office. So if you've had all that struggle to get to the top of the greasy pole and become Prime Minister, you're unlikely to be the sort of person that wants to go and put their feet up and do nothing. So, it's taken me a long time to build the Institute, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but I think I'm finally at the point where now we can really have some strong impact. And I've got a great team of people working for me. There's almost 1,000 people in the Institute today. So now I'm focusing on that. I mean, of course, there's no one who's ever been Prime Minister that there's not an element of regret when you leave, but you do have to leave. So, you might as well stop. I don't spend any time worrying about it.
No, not returning to the shepherd's hut just yet, though, either.
No, that would not be for me.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you.